The title, History Writing as a Narrative Art, is an important methodological statement. It's saying essentially that you can't write history, good history, electrifying history, history that communicates to an audience, or even history that is true to the degree that history can ever be true, without resort to narrative, without resort to storytelling. If you look up your German, you encounter this interesting fact that the word history, Geschichte, is also the word for story. The two are linked in a way that is, the purpose of the course is to make that linkage problematic. You can't write history without recourse to narrative, because history is the attempt to put order in, to give a temporal sequence to events in time. It matters intensely to a historian that something happened before something else and after something else. Narration, putting order in time, is what we do. It matters that the Munich sellout of Czechoslovakia happened in 1938, not in 1934, and not in 1939. We care about the sequence of events, and because we care about the sequence of events, and we are committed to narration, first this, then this, then this. We also know that some of the most moving, persuasive, emotionally satisfying history we ever read takes the form of a story. Using the story form is essential to communicating our findings to audiences. But here are the traps with storytelling. And there's been a huge explosion of interest in the historical profession about the pitfalls of storytelling. Let's look at a few of them. The first pitfall, oddly, is a story has a beginning and an ending. One of the biggest problems that you will have as young researchers is, what is the beginning of my story? What is the end of my story? Time moves seamlessly. Time does not have beginnings and endings. It moves seamlessly. One of the problems you've got is, where do I start my story? If you're a historian of the First World War, and we'll look at a great history of the First World War, where does that historian start his narrative? You don't start it in June 28, 1914, when Archduke Ferdinand pulls up into an alleyway by mistake and gets shot. So where do you start it? You might start the history of the First World War back in the Crimean War, to the beginning of the collapse of the international system of the 19th century. So where you start this story is a key decision in all of your work as historians. Similarly, where do you end a story? Is the First World War even over? Go to a French village, as I did in July, and what do you see in the center of the French village? A monument to the men who didn't come home to that village from the First World War. It's still there. It's at the center of the historical consciousness of that community. So is the First World War over? Complicated, right? So stories have beginnings and endings. Where's the beginning? Where's the ending? That's one problem with storytelling history. Another problem is that all stories have to have characters. There has to be the maiden in distress, forgive me, I'm just asking you to play a role. You have to, and the heroic bearded knight who rescues the lady in distress, etc. Right? Sorry, normal service will be resumed. Just for so you have stories and characters. But what do you do about the forces of historical change that don't have characters? One of the biggest changes sweeping through your generation is demographic. you're having less children than your parents and your grandparents. It's a huge generation-wide change. It doesn't have a subject. It doesn't have a character, but it's a driver of the historical experience that you're living through. How do you make play for what used to be called vast impersonal historical forces in history if you have a story format that privileges characters? And the second problem is, if you privilege characters, you privilege the role of intention, specific intention by specific actors, the maiden in the tower, the heroic knight, as opposed to the chivalric culture of the time that made this whole ridiculous thing possible in the first place. So the question of how you privilege your characters in a story is extremely important. The other thing, finally, about a story is it has a moral. It has a happy ending. It has a meaning. You tell the story to deliver a meaning. We have one spectacular example of this currently working through international politics. Vladimir Putin, during the COVID crisis, spent his time constructing a historical narrative of relations between the Ukrainian and Russian people, whose purpose was to show that Ukraine has never been a separate independent country. It has always been part of Russia and deserves to be in the Russian Empire in perpetuity. We will look at that narrative because that's a narrative fraught with a particular meaning. Ukrainians look at that narrative and think, are you nuts? You have just denied 300-400 years of our attempt to be an independent, self-governing people, right? So the meaning attached to narrative has explosive historical consequences. And the problem for you as young historians is you're in the business of giving meaning to your material. And it presents you with a moral challenge that we need to focus upon. I have done historical research way back. My first book was the history of the penitentiary. And so I spent months, even years, in archives. And what I remember vividly was the moral temptation to let my story run ahead of what I found in the archive. I worked patiently for months constructing a story about how the penitentiary became possible. And then, God damn it, I would come across a piece of evidence that blew my story out of the water. I read some narrative of the time that said it didn't happen that way at all. Or I'd find some piece of evidence that just a piece of factual evidence that contradicted the story I wanted to tell. And out the window goes the story. Out the window goes the order that I had put on my narrative. And then you have, we don't talk enough as historians about the moral dimensions of serving truth. The moral dimension of serving truth is very direct for you as young researchers. If you find things that contradict the narrative that you invested meaning into, give up the narrative. Have the guts to throw it out and start again. Very difficult. You're under tight deadlines. Nobody's going to see that piece of evidence anyway. The thing is covered in dust and nobody's been in that archive. You're the first one there. The temptation to falsify in the service of meaning is the risk that I want you to focus on, right? So these are some of the issues about the pitfalls of storytelling. You can't escape meaning giving. You can't escape narrative construction in history. That's why history is an art, in my view, not a science, but it's an art that must respect the stubborn, recalcitrant character of facts as you find them in an archive. And that triggers the moral responsibility to truth. So we're going to look. I could give you, and I will not do so, a whole sheaf of highly theoretical Foucaultian blah, blah, blah about this problem. But we're not going to do that. You can do it. I can't understand some of this stuff and I'm too old to try, so I'm not doing that. What I am going to do with you, with enthusiasm, is to look at some truly great pieces of historical writing. We're going to look at Alexis de Tocqueville, L'Ancien Régime in the French Revolution. We're going to pair it with Jules Michelet's History of the French Revolution. We're going to read 50, 60 pages of each, and you'll see two transcendently great historians wrestling with this problem. Michelet telling this fantastically emotional story of the meaning of the French Revolution to him, and Alexis de Tocqueville looking at the same story and telling a completely a different emotional, moral, political approach to the same text. And we'll look at how they both construct these competing narratives. We will look at probably Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers, History of the Coming of the First World War, because it's a masterpiece of contemporary narrative, which addresses the question I addressed earlier, which is when do things start and when do they end? We will look at a great historian, Natalie Zeman Davis, wonderful early modern historian who wrote this famous book about the return of Martin Guerre based on a single text from the 16th century, in which a man returns from the war and claims he's the husband of a woman who hasn't seen him for 3 or 4 years. And the whole question is he really Martin Guerre or isn't he? And so it's a question about truth within a narrative. And I think you'll find that interesting. We will also look at the political uses of historical narrative, namely Vladimir Putin's on the historical relations between the Russian and the Ukrainian people, to look at how political actors use narrative to create what could be called political fictions. And we'll look at some other things, but that's the basic menu for the course. It's a pass-fail course. It is 6 sessions long. It will run in May in an intensive sequence. You may meet on a Monday, on a Wednesday, and on a Friday, and then again on a Monday and on a Wednesday the following week, depending on how we work it. The classes will be 90 minutes long. Occasionally because people's schedules are very difficult to work, put 2 classes together. The last class, we run it as a 3-hour class rather than a 90-minute class. It's a pass-fail. Your only assignment in the class is a 1,000-word essay of reflection on what you've taken from the class. What students have found useful about it is that it does address very directly some practical problems they may be having doing their own master's theses. It's designed to be helpful because you're all dealing with narrative, with meaning, with beginnings, with endings, with characters, with the weight to accord to non-individual forces like demography. And so I'm hoping that this course will not be a kind of week of kind of interesting, vague theoretical effusions, but it'll have 2 benefits. One of them is you're going to read some absolutely fabulous history. If this stuff doesn't excite you, I don't know what the hell to do with it. That's number one. And number 2, it may help you to think through some of the methodological issues that you're having as you write your work. So that's what we're going to do. We've got 5 minutes for questions. The schedule for this, which is important to you because you've got stuff going on in April and May. I'll try and post that as soon as I can. The reading list for last year is now up on the website, so you can take a closer look. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. So, questions, sir?
So I know it's a short course, so there's probably not time, but does it cover just the history, like depictions and narratives in physical media, or does it also talk about, because there's a recent trend, a lot of historical depictions in like online media and like film, and a lot of these things have these sort of historical narratives, somewhat revisionist histories they're doing.
I have not assigned a film, but I'm tempted. And it wouldn't preclude you. There were presentations in this class as well, by the way. I'd like people to get up and essentially present the reading. That is, not summarize the reading, but in the case of Tocqueville and Michelet, try and capture what it is about their use of storytelling that is exciting you or perplexing you. Or could we do a film? Okay, let me challenge you. What film would you put up there?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of like historical films. I mean, there's some that are really good and I think do a good job capturing like a topic. But then you look at like some of the recent more popular films, like the Napoleon movie that came out last year was terribly inaccurate. But that's a lot of people's like only depiction of what that kind of event series is.
Yes. Yes, Napoleon, boy, that was. That's perfect. Let me think about that. I focused on historical writing because you're master's students in history. Most of you are unlikely to make films, although some of you will maybe. So let me think about that. Because I can immediately think of some, fantastic films whose greatness is that they recreate the atmosphere of the historical period so vividly. And those atmospheres are constantly disappearing on us as the people who lived through those periods died. And part of what makes Napoleon so awful fake is that the atmosphere isn't there. Nothing. Okay, another question. Okay, we're at time. As I said earlier, I'm here for another 20 minutes for anybody who has private questions or issues they wanted to raise with me. Well, the final thing, I don't know whether I said this, so this is the last time I'm teaching this. I've taught this for many years with great enjoyment and pleasure, but I'm retiring at the end of June. So I'm hanging, as we say in Canada, I am hanging up my skates. And so it's your last chance to take the class. And I don't want to go out with a whimper. I want to go out with a bang. I think I said this to you before. So the last class is for me a big deal, an opportunity. Let it all hang out. So there we go. Okay, thank you all.